IAB there. This is our regular program in which we connect the digital advertising ecosystem. Our topic for today is COVID's impact on e-commerce and consumer shopping behavior. We have two very special guests with us today. We have Brian Weiner, the CEO of Profitero, and then in our second segment, we'll be joined by Surabhi Pokhriyal. She is the Global Director of E-commerce Acceleration for Johnson & Johnson. Let's bring Brian Weiner onto the stream first thing, please, and we'll get going. Brian Weiner, welcome to IAB there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to see you again, Brad.
So you have a storied history in the industry, and I'd like to ask you to kind of weave for us the story of why you're at Profitero. I first became aware of you when you were at 360i, and my memory from an earlier conversation is that 360i sort of existed to make search make sense for brands and later to make social make sense for brands. So what's the through line here with what you're doing at Profitero?
So first of all, you have a good memory. And we started getting going in my company in 2004. And our vision was around making search work for brands. And I'll kind of relate it back to today, but at the time we saw it didn't take a genius to realize that Google search was taking off. But yet when you looked at what was happening in the marketing ecosystem and infrastructure, nothing really, the evolution was not matching consumer behavior. And so my partner and I at the time saw a big opportunity to build a tech platform and maybe some tech services around it. And so we ended up buying a small company and launching a tech platform that was helping people do bid management on search. What we realized pretty quickly is the brands didn't have the people to manage it. So we started launching more and more services. That became 360i, and it was in search. This is 2004, 2005. Similarly, in 2006, we saw the rise of social, and I had been at a social media company called theglobe.com in the 90s, which was one of the early ones. So I was pretty familiar with it, and I saw the same pattern happening. And I actually hired Sarah Hofstetter, who we used to work together previously, to start a blog PR practice. And part of it was to do social media outreach via blogs. Facebook and Twitter weren't there at the time. And the other part of it was to help SEO rankings, because blogs were a huge part of that. And that led to a Facebook practice and Twitter and a social media. And 360i actually blossomed we built a full service media agency out of search and a full service strategy and creative agency out of social, and brought those all together. And so that was a hugely successful effort. We eventually ended up selling the Dentsu and staying on for quite some time. If you fast forward to now, 2020, Sarah and I were working with some private equity firms looking at businesses to potentially go into, and we looked at e-commerce and we saw the exact same things happening in e-commerce that we happened in search and social. Now this is pre-COVID. We were looking at this late 2019, and it was obvious e-commerce was growing. But if you looked at how brands were adapting to it, it was still pretty slow. And so we saw a big opportunity there.
My memory of one of the many career highlights for 360i was during the Super Bowl, when in real time, your team created the "You Can Dunk in the Dark" for Mondelez and the Oreo, which was quite celebrated at the time. So we'll be waiting for that Super Bowl moment from Profitero and bring you back at the time that happened. Let's talk about what you're seeing out there. We launched this particular show in March, and although it's not the COVID show, because that would be a bummer, we are always talking about the massive acceleration that seems to be happening. That with COVID, a lot of behaviors and trends that were seedlings, before we all sort of got shut in our homes back in March, have had accelerated growth, like in a cartoon. So what are you seeing in terms of how consumer behavior is changing on the e-commerce side? Like, what's the high level?
Sure. Well, overall, aside from all of our lives being chaotic, the business environment is as chaotic as it's ever been. And you named Oreo as one of our more famous and long-lasting clients. Another one was HBO. And I always like to quote Lord Baelish from Game of Thrones, where he said, "Chaos is a ladder." And so there is a lot of chaos out there, and it's driven by what we're all seeing in our own lives, which is online shopping as a way of life and existence because we have to. It's sort of survival. And I'd say in terms of things that are probably most notable has been in the grocery space. I mean,
Hmm.
customers have tripled this year, tripled. And at one point, we're like, okay, this is going to be a blip. But this is, now that we're on month 9, 8, 9 of this, and by the time we're done, it's fairly it's fairly easy to predict that this is going to become a permanent behavior habit. Not that stores are going to want to go away completely, but it's probably far more likely to be closer to where we are today in terms of shopping behavior than where we were before. And the other thing is it brought very different consumers, especially older consumers who weren't quite comfortable with online shopping and in particular grocery. And so I think a recent survey I saw was that 81% of Americans who've been buying groceries intend to keep doing so permanently. So
Buying groceries online. Yeah.
buying groceries online, sure.
And this is
So
a behavior that we've seen elsewhere in the world. Korea, for example, there was that famous Tesco subway station where people could touch their phone to different pictures of groceries and have them delivered shortly thereafter. It just people in the United States have lagged behind for some time. So you're seeing. I think what I'm hearing is that you think that online grocery delivery or delivery of groceries purchased online is going to be a stable behavior after we have a vaccine, and we're sort of. I don't think we'll ever go back, but when our lives look a little bit more like they used to. What other behaviors do you think are going to be permanent, or what shopping behaviors do you think are going to snap back to pre-pandemic ways of being?
well, one, I want to draw a sharp distinction here between buying online and how you actually receive the goods. Because I think historically it's sort of been synonymous. We envision we bought something online and a couple days later a package shows up from Amazon at our front door. What I would say is there's buying online is here to stay. But what we've seen is a huge surge in buying online and picking up in store,
Hmm.
and also buying online and delivery. And so I think different parts of the country, different segments of consumers are going to want different types of the way they receive the goods. But the purchasing, going from browsing to the transaction happening online is something that is here to stay and is going to be here in increasing amounts.
At the time of this episode of Ivy There's airing, we are just after our brand disruption summit, where buying online, BOPIS, buy online, pick up in store, is one of many sort of hot topics of conversation. So we're talking about consumer behavior right now. Let me just reiterate one question, because again, I think I interrupted you and I apologize. What do you have any sense of behaviors that will sort of snap back? I, for example, think that we've seen again and again that the moment that it seems safe for people to go to a bar or a restaurant, there's this pent up demand to be to be in those locations. I'm wondering on the ecom side if there's anything you think will snap back to earlier forms of behavior.
I think in terms of restaurants are their own category. I firmly believe that we're all thrive human interaction. So I think that absolutely will come back. I think, but specifically as it relates to ecom, I think apparel is going to go back not to what it was, but people want to try clothes on in much more ways than they would for, let's say, household goods. And Sarabi might have a different point of view on this, but I think it's very different. I don't think it's a great experience buying things at CVS or at Kroger. That's not something people thrive on. There are certain things you may want to go there for, like touching vegetables, picking out meat, but that doesn't mean you can't pre-purchase most of the things in your cart, have it delivered, have it picked up while you're there, and just focus on the things that you really want to touch and feel.
And so just to make clear, Profitero is in the business of supporting all of that, not just sort of typical Amazonian, say, ecom. Let's talk about your clients, which
Yep.
is there have been a bunch of changes across how brands are thinking about ecom. How are you seeing, and this will be a setup, when we bring Sarabi on, my first question would be to ask her how wrong we are. But what are you seeing in terms of brands changing their organizations or their orientation around e-com, which has always been, in a complicated place?
Absolutely. And as you said, Sarabi is living and breathing it every day. I think one of the benefits that we have is we're working with a whole host of CPGs. Our largest clients are Kraft Heinz and General Mills, Clorox's of the world, L'Oreal, obviously J&J is a client. So we have the benefit of seeing and talking to clients and seeing different ways that they're handling these challenges. And I'd say different CPGs are at different stages on the e-commerce maturity curve. And so there is this range of e-commerce centralization as sort of a center of excellence versus decentralization. There is evangelization where you're trying to educate and convince people that this is the wave of the future. It's not a blip. I think that's much less hard to do now than it was 10 months ago. And then there is, how do you actually transform the organization? It's one thing when it is 6 or 7% of sales. It's another thing when it's 20% of sales and it's 50%. It's growing at 50%. How do you actually transform your organization to handle that? And if you look at the growth rates that a lot of the CPGs are reporting, you're talking about 40, 50, 60% increases in e-commerce. And that puts a strain on the entire system, including the supply chain. So to answer your question, every organization is different, but what I will say, it's the same thing I saw when digital really was taking off. Organizational and ecosystem dynamics are probably the biggest inhibitor en masse to CPGs being successful here. In order to be successful, you not only have to be aligned internally, but you have to have the right systems, you need to have the right service providers, you need to have the right technology to be able to make decisions and move at the speed of consumer. And that's much easier to talk about at a conference or on a podcast than it is to actually make happen in reality. And these are things that we are trying to help clear out in our small way as part of the ecosystem by making analytics and data more visible, more transparent, and more portable so that CPGs and their service providers can make decisions, informed decisions based on actionable insights. But that's only one piece of the puzzle.
Let's take a moment to double click on this, to quote our CEO, David Cohen, because I think what I neglected to do is get the what is Profitero? Like what's the tweetable explanation of what your company does and why, for its clients in the brand case, and how it's a bridge between brands and online retailers.
I got to do that in 140 characters.
Thereabouts.
Well, we're a software analytics platform. And so, as I said, we're giving brands the data and insights across hundreds of retailers around the globe that helps them grow their e-commerce sales. So we help them answer questions like, are your products in stock on Walmart or an Amazon or a Tesco, as you mentioned? What are pricing and promotions look like for your product as well as your competitor products? How is it available to be delivered, shipped, in what time period? What are consumers saying about your product? Meaning, what are your ratings and reviews? And then lastly, what's your market share? Is it going up or down? So these are the questions we're trying to help answer, and so that brands can make more informed decisions.
And before we bring Sarabi on, one last question, which is, we are seeing and hearing that the holiday season is going to be, a barn buster for e-com because people don't want to go to the stores because retail shops are closing at an amazingly accelerated rate. So how are your clients preparing for this? What are they doing? And then, since we're not naming any of them in this question, what ought they to be doing if you had your druthers?
Well, it's funny because what we've all learned is the most important thing is your product in stock. And that's something that we have taken for granted. Now, for some of the people in your audience, they might not realize this, but when CPGs are selling on a Walmart or an Amazon, they're selling wholesale to these retailers. They don't have perfect visibility into a lot of these items about like when is your product available. And what we learned, we did some research on this. When your product is non-stock, you obviously lose that sale. But 75% of the people that we surveyed in this cheating consumer said that they would consider staying with the new brand that they chose for that particular purchase. Now, whether that actually holds up or not, time will tell. We're going to track that. But I think that what all brands have realized is the first question is, my product needs to be available. The second question is, if it is available, how do I promote it and differentiate it against the competitors out there? I'd say the last point, you asked about the gangbuster e-commerce, and I'm sure it will be. I think one of the questions, though, that we're all wondering is, with Prime Day getting pulled into happening in October and Walmart doing a similar type sales, how much of the holiday season got pulled forward versus is that additive to the overall sales for the holiday season? And so I think we'll know that answer pretty soon, because we've got the Turkey 5 coming up, where you have, the Friday through Cyber Monday, Thanksgiving through Cyber Monday, and we'll know a lot more then.
Well, hopefully you'll come back and report back to us on what you've learned. I have to just say that a thinker I admire a great deal is a man named Byron Sharp, who wrote a book called How Brands Grow, and the extraordinarily reductive thesis of his book. His thesis isn't reductive, my account is reductive, is that in order for a brand to grow, people need to know about it and they need to be able to buy it. And so what you were just saying about consumers being willing to trial alternatives because they can't get their favorite brand in the store because of COVID, those are likely to be lasting behaviors. At least I believe they will be. But let's bring Surabhi Pokhriyal, Global Director of E-commerce Acceleration for Johnson & Johnson, into the stream. Hi, Surabhi. Welcome to I Be There. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks for having me. Hi, Brian.
So the first question, which I teased a couple of minutes ago, is tell us where we're wrong. Right? What are we missing? Brian has the agent kind of perspective across a lot of brands. I have the analyst perspective sitting in my chair. You're living and breathing this. What are you seeing about consumer behavior changing, about uptake for your brands? Just what were you reacting to as we were chatting?
I was head nodding a lot through that black screen. So let me say I aligned to a lot of conversations that I heard. But I will say that we are in a moment when you talk of habits that will not go back to the old normal. First of all, let me say, like, normal in my mind is only a setting on the dishwasher or dryer, right? It's just that's the only where normal is. Everything else has changed for good. So having said that, Brian, when you were mentioning going back to the store for those high touch, high consideration kind of items, be it your meat or produce and things like that, I feel in apparel and other sectors, especially in luxury goods, there will be a value to go to the store for experience, but not the product. We have seen a lot of case studies coming out where Canada Goose is shutting down all its store, just putting one or two of those parkas, just a couple of colors, where the intention is not for the person to come in, try out and buy it in the store, but the intention is to experience the assortment and see that as a differentiator. I think that is the kind of new retail that might take up after the pandemic as a new behavior, because for low consideration items, for folks who have started doing grocery online, and the 80% people, brand, that you were mentioning, especially the older demographic who at one point could not discriminate between Instacart and Instagram, and now that they are able to discriminate, they are here to stick for the most part.
I do want to take a quick sidebar and say what I should have said as you were coming in, which is that you're not speaking on behalf of Johnson & Johnson today, Surabhi. You're sharing your expertise as a longtime practitioner, just to make sure that the audience is clear about that. So forgive me for not having said that at first. So what are the big opportunities that you see, Surabhi? And then Brian, please feel free to jump in. Sort of unexploited opportunities for e-com on the brand side?
I would say when e-commerce started, or when the topic started coming up 20, 30 years back, it was electronic commerce. In my mind, it is still electronic commerce, but it's also everywhere commerce, right? What you do digitally influences your offline sales to a large extent, and vice versa, right? I think brands and companies are not coming up to the fact that it is no longer the seemingly channel conflict that executives thought over the years. There is actually not a conflict. The only conflict that you have is whether your brand is bought or the competitor brand is bought. It's not about which channel you are selling. So I'll say it's become very much channel agnostic. In my view, one of the big opportunities is in the media spend. We do a ton of analysis. Big companies have, deep pockets where media is spent both on the retailer platform and outside retailer platform. But are brands truly monitoring the retailer and ex-retailer media platform almost like they would monitor their stock portfolio and continually tweaking it? How much do I spend in equity? How much do I invest in bonds? How much do I put in gold? And then optimizing it. I don't think that kind of rigor exists in many companies today. And there's a big opportunity to do that, because your media optimization, both within the retailer platform and ex-retailer, is going to have a big impact to your e-commerce top line.
Huh. Brian, anything to add on that?
Well, first of all, I just had a flashback to, I remember in like 15 years ago when we were trying to hire people, and all the people in the media agencies were used to negotiating over lunch, and you realized that you needed to actually go find math majors instead of lit majors to actually be able to handle performance marketing. And so I totally agree with Surabhi. In fact, one of the things that we see as a big opportunity in working with our clients is connecting product analytics with media analytics. So we don't actually buy the media, but what we found is people who are buying the retail media don't always have the product analytics at their fingertips, meaning, is the product actually in stock? Is it converting well? And what kind of traffic is it getting? These are very simple questions that are not generally available. We have that data. The people who have fingers on keyboards making the media buying decisions don't. And so what we decided to do is we created this open ecosystem where we partner with Kenshu and PackView, which are two of the larger tech platforms in the retail space, and every agency holding company, making Profitero available to them on behalf of our clients, so that the people who are actually making the decisions, as Surabhi said, to connect that media, have this information, because it's just so critical. I think the biggest organizational element that I see in terms of an opportunity is this is connecting sales and marketing together in a way that just hasn't historically happened at CPGs. And media is that connective tissue, or at least needs to be.
And Surabhi, do you want to follow up on that? Because I think you're running a team that's dependent on this sort of data, or at least potentially could be.
I cannot agree more to that part. I put the analogy, sales and marketing teams traditionally are like train tracks going parallelly in the same direction, but not always, hand in glove with each other. And that's the big opportunity for a lot of companies, that the commerce part of e-commerce is the sales part, but the electronic digital engagement is the marketing part. So unless you get both of these parties sitting on the same table, aligned and looking at the same opportunity with the same goals and incentivized for the same outcomes, this may not happen as fast as desired.
Digital transformation is not easy, and I'm curious if either of you could share, a couple of questions to ask or a couple of steps to take. How, for example, do you have to realign people's incentives in order to get them to work together appropriately, to get different departments to work together, so that people will take advantage of the connection between commerce data and media data? Are there any first steps for people listening, thinking, I don't know where to start?
I'll just say in a very simplistic manner, and I don't think this is relevant to only digital. What gets measured gets delivered for the most part, right? When we start measuring the outcomes that we want to attain and start incentivizing people for those outcomes, things start changing. So while there can be this big, hairy, audacious goal of saying we want to undergo digital transformation, we want to be more agile, you can do N number of agile workshops and trainings, but the outcomes may not be dramatically different till we start incentivizing people for saying, this year, X% of your business has to be e-commerce or above. This year, Y% of your media has to be digital, right? So those are just a couple of, my personal observations from my, career in the CPG sector.
So Brian, what first steps that people listening might take?
Well, Surabhi has a lot more experience with it. I mean, I don't have any experience inside of a CPG, so I would definitely listen to her more on that front. My viewpoint comes from working with CPGs, but also running companies. And what I've found is when you want to do something pretty transformational, which I've had to do with a bunch of the companies I'm running, is you have to lay out a vision but then you got to get some small wins. And so trying to do you don't want to go elephant hunting on these types of things. If you get people working together on a particular project and they experience success, they'll want more of that. And so incentives are important. Measurement is critical. But I think ultimately you have to simplify things so people actually understand how to move forward. I've always found if you give someone a blank piece of paper, they're paralyzed. But most people, if you give a template, they can actually get going. And I think this is a similar way. So if you talk about sales and marketing, get them some wins. The people who are buying the media, they want the data. You just got to make it easy for them.
Fascinating. So let's make a distinction, which is we've been seeing consumer behavior changing across a lot of different vectors, including embracing direct-to-consumer models. And I know from conversations with other CPGs that many CPGs are launching direct-to-consumer brands. So for question to both of you, but Surabhi, you first, please, talk about how you think about D2C differently than retail-focused or retailer e-com. What's different about your approach, or is there a difference?
I would say the similarity first in D2C and the typical e-commerce that we speak is both are storefronts at the end of the day, right? Both are meant for inspiring, engaging with the consumer, and hopefully having a transaction. So that's a similarity. I would say the difference is, if I can be a little provocative, D2C should not be you shall build and they shall come. No, that will not happen. And sorry to bust your bubble, D2C is not a shiny object that you want to check off because some executive says everybody's doing D2C, let's do D2C, right? And two years down the line, you realize your top line is not meeting any bit of the kind of sales you're seeing on Amazon, and then you say, oh, but D2C is useless. No, it's not. D2C can be very effective if you have a decent value exchange with your consumer. Are you providing them a unique assortment that's not available anywhere else? Are you providing them a unique price point? Is there a certain loyalty component that they cannot get anywhere else, right?